All right, welcome everyone, and thank you for coming to our Nobles Graduate Author Talk. I'm thrilled to introduce George Colt this afternoon. George graduated from Nobles in 1972, and he went on to Harvard as an undergrad, as well as Johns Hopkins for graduate school. Today, George will mostly be talking about his recent book, The Game, Harvard, Yale, and America in 1968. The book tells the story of the 1968 Harvard-Yale football game. I know some of you were actually at the game. And for those of you who weren't, it was a legendary 29-29 tie that is on nearly every list of the top 10 most exciting games in college gridiron history. So I read the book back in December and I literally could not put it down. So the book also tells the story of a watershed year in American history as navigated by a group of young men and by the contrasting institutions that they attended. So George will talk about that as well. He's also the author of The Big House, A Century in the Life of an American Summer Home, which was a New York Times notable book and a finalist for the 2003 National Book Award, as well as Brothers, the winner of the 2013 Massachusetts Book Award for Nonfiction, and November of the Soul, a critically acclaimed study of suicide. His work has appeared in the New York Times, Civilization, and Mother Jones, among other publications, and he is currently working on a fifth book. He has taught at Smith College and was for many years a staff writer at Life magazine. George lives in Western Massachusetts with his wife, Anne, and I'm thrilled to welcome George and turn it over to him. All right, so I'm going to ask you to unmute. There we go.
Thank you so much, Kate, for that lovely introduction. And I'm thinking, as I look at your faces, I wonder whether I'm dying, because don't they say when you're dying, your life flashes before your eyes and all the people you've ever known you see in parade before you? I hope that's not the case, but it's wonderful to see you all. So many warm memories, almost all of them good, are coming up as I see your faces. Familiar faces, some of them admittedly a little less familiar than they were 45 years ago. We've all changed a bit. But I want to thank you for being here, taking time out of your schedules to be here. And I want to say, first of all, I'll understand if you Massachusetts residents over the age of 65 and over start yawning after getting up at 4 o'clock this morning to refresh your screens in hopes of scoring a COVID vaccination appointment, only to find the site had crashed. So I'm here to answer the burning question you all are probably too polite to ask. What on earth possesses a writer to write a book about a football game between two hoity-toity Ivy League schools that took place more than half a century ago? Well, to answer that question, I want to go back to 1967, to the playing fields of the Noble and Greenough School. In the fall of 1967, I was a newly arrived 8th grader trying out for the intermediate football team, which was the sort of polite word, the official name for what everybody else called midget football. By the way, I just want to take a quick poll. Raise your hand if you were a Mohawk. And how about Oneida? Okay, and for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, it means good for you, you're a lot younger than we are. I was an Oneida, but I secretly wanted to be a Mohawk because the name sounded so much tougher. And that helped because it was really hard to look tough in that ancient cast-off equipment we had to wear. Some of the helmets, I remember, looked as if they might have been used during the Peloponnesian War. I remember, and you may remember this too, this desperate race on the first day of practice to get a good helmet. You didn't really care whether it fit you or not. You just wanted one that didn't make you look like a complete dork. So our coach, as you may recall, was our English teacher, Bob Bulkley, recent Yale graduate. His coaching philosophy boiled down to one key motivational phrase he used for every situation: play hard, play to win, never give up. Well, like all Nobles football teams at the time, we midgets played the single wing formation, which of course a year or two later would go the way, for good reason, would go the way of the dodo. I was the team's four-back, which meant that I did most of the passing, not at all well. My signature play was I'd fade back, 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 and then I'd throw the long bomb, which in my case meant hurling the football as far as I could in the general direction of the line of scrimmage before I was buried in a pile of hulking linemen some of whom must have weighed as much as 120 pounds. I loved playing midget football, at least until I met my own personal Waterloo. I'm speaking here from the Napoleonic point of view, on the rocky playing fields of Belmont Hill. So the first play of the game, I look across the line of scrimmage at the Belmont Hill middle linebacker. He did not look like someone who should have been permitted to play midget football. First of all, he was the size of a small blimp, but an extremely muscular blimp. Second, as he stared across at me at the line of scrimmage, he began growling. And third, and most terrifying of all, and to help you fully understand my terror, I should let you know, without going into too much detail, that at that point in time, I hadn't really reached puberty. I saw that this middle linebacker sported what appeared to be the beginnings of a mustache. At that moment, I had an epiphany. Soccer was the game for me. We lost 28-0 to Belmont Hill, and I'm just grateful that quarterback ratings hadn't been invented yet. So at the end of my first and only season of Nobles football, I announced my retirement. I was taking my talents, such as they were, to the soccer field. But I still loved the sport, and I continued to attend Harvard football games with my father each Saturday afternoon, which is how I was fortunate enough to be at Harvard Stadium on the afternoon of November 23rd, 1968. Perhaps some of you were there too. For those of you who were, and I want to give you a very brief Cliff Notes version of what you missed, arguably the most thrilling college football game of all time. Both teams came into the game undefeated. Yale had won 16 straight games. It was the longest winning streak in the country at the time. They were ranked 16th in the national football polls, ahead of, and if you know anything at all about football, you probably won't believe this, they were ranked ahead of Alabama and Nebraska. It hasn't happened since then. They were led by a quarterback whose nickname was God. He had not lost a game since the 7th grade. Harvard was ranked 24th in the country. They were led by a suffocating defense who'd been known as the Boston Stranglers. Yale was 3rd in the nation in total offense. Harvard was 1st in scoring defense. And all week long before the game, the Boston sports writers agreed that this would be the football game that finally decided that age-old question. What happened when an irresistible force, Yale offense, met an immovable object, the Harvard defense? Well, the irresistible force, Yale, was favored by 1 touchdown, but almost no one believed it would be anywhere near that close. And indeed, for 56.5 minutes, it wasn't. God and his apostles raced out to a 22-0 lead. And midway through the 4th quarter, Yale was ahead 29-13, and the first of more than 5,000 disappointed Harvard fans began to file out of the stadium. I hope none of you were among them. So, spoiler alert, going to give away the ending. In this absolutely unbelievable confluence of events, timely plays, questionable coaching decisions, questionable refereeing decisions, fortuitous bounces, and the kind of blind luck that the future New Yorker editor Hendrik Hertzberg would describe as the football equivalent of a multiple orgasm, Harvard scored 16 points in the final 42 seconds, almost a mathematical impossibility, to tie Yale and inspire what would be one of the most famous headlines of all time in the sports section. Harvard beats Yale 29-29. Raise your hand if you remember the Boston Globe sports writer, Bud Collins. Okay, a lot of you do. Polka dot bow ties, purple prose. Here's what he wrote about the game. It was a good trip if you sat on the Harvard side, a bad trip if you sat with the Yaleys, but it was a mind blower either way for the 43,000 people scrunched around the field. And maybe it was disillusioning for the students in the joint who had felt that nothing like this 29-29 game was possible to experience without drugs. It was the 1960s. So that was a very exciting game. I remembered it for a long time, but it never would have occurred to me to write a book until about 7 years ago on a Friday night when my wife Ann and I were looking for something to watch on Netflix. and we came across a documentary film, the title of which was Harvard Beats Yale 29-29. Perhaps some of you have seen it. We tuned in, and in it, the players on the field that day, who by now were middle-aged, they had receding hairlines, expanding waistlines, artificial knees. They reminisce about that game. They remember what took place on the field that day. Now, like me, my wife, Anne, attended Harvard in the early 70s, but unlike me, she hadn't been at that 68 game. Unlike me, she didn't care a whit about football, and yet she was no less transfixed by the film than I, because it was a tremendously moving film to see them look back on what took place on the field that day. After it was over, Anne and I stayed up literally until 3 a.m. that night, talking about the game, talking about the players, talking about what we'd been like in 1968, talking about what Harvard might have been like in 68, what Yale might have been like, and what they were like now. But mostly what we talked about was 1968. And it all came flooding back. And I'm sure many of you remember that year. For some of you, you may not be able to forget that year. It was the year Martin Luther King was assassinated, followed 8 weeks later by the assassination of Bobby Kennedy. You may remember that the assassination of Bobby Kennedy took place, I believe, the night before, or maybe 2 nights before, the Nobles graduation of 1968. I clearly remember sitting in the gym, that old gym, watching the seniors file up and get their diplomas, and all of us absolutely in a state of total shock. It was also the year of the Tet Offensive. It was the year of the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, with police beating the protesters on the street. Year of more than 100 inner city riots, year than more than a dozen college campus takeovers. It's the year of the sexual revolution, beginning of the women's liberation movement. Civil rights was morphing to Black power. It's the year John Carlos and Tommy Smith raised black gloved fists on the podium at the Mexico City Olympics. And of course, looming over everything was the war in Vietnam. It was such a polarized time. The country seemed absolutely divided and irrevocably divided. Hawk versus dove, black versus white, young versus old, student versus administrator, hippie versus hard hat, feminist versus chauvinist. Do you remember the expression that everybody used in those days? Which side are you on? You had to take a side. You were on one side or another. One historian would later write that 1968 was the year in which our country hadn't been more divided since the Civil War. In that context, that 29-29 tie between these two arch rivals seemed to me this kind of miraculous truce. And I woke up the next morning after that long talk with my wife, and I knew I wanted to write about the game and the era in which it was played. I wanted to know who those middle-aged lawyers and bankers, and also high school teachers, social workers, pediatric neurosurgeons, those people that I'd seen in the movie, who had they been when they walked out onto the field that afternoon on November 23rd, 1968? Who had they been when they were 19, 20, and 21? Had they been hawks or doves? What did they do about the draft? Had they voted for Nixon or Humphrey? Did they admire Martin Luther King or Malcolm X? Did they listen to the Beatles or the Rolling Stones? How long was their hair? What were they drinking? What were they smoking? Which side were they on? How, in short, did they navigate what one Yale player described to me as that great and terrible time? Now, I suppose I was interested in writing about it too, because at age 14, I was trying to figure out how I was going to navigate that great and terrible time. Like many families at the time, my family was sort of polarized. My father was a World War II vet, and he couldn't understand why anybody could possibly protest the Vietnam War. 2 weeks before the game in the presidential election, he had voted for Richard Nixon. My dad was a fundraiser for Harvard College, which is why we were at those Harvard football games. And he worshiped all things Harvard, especially Harvard football. You know, in the book, I mention a Harvard alumnus who in 1963, after John F. Kennedy was assassinated, the very day before the Harvard-Yale football game, and the presidents of Harvard and Yale agreed to postpone the game for a week. Well, there were a number of alumni who were very upset about that. And one in particular, I know, turned to his wife and said, "How can they do that? They can't do that. It's the Harvard-Yale game." And I'm a little embarrassed to admit that that alumnus was my father. So that was my father. My mother, on the other hand, in 1968, she was attending peace marches. She was writing folk masses. She was out proselytizing for Eugene McCarthy, reading Betty Friedan and James Baldwin. She was teaching kids, including me, how to play Mr. Tambourine Man on the guitar. And so as I looked at my parents, I was trying to decide, which side am I on? And actually about 4 weeks after that Harvard-Yale game, under the Colt family Christmas tree, I got two presents. One of them was a record album, and it was it was a recording of the radio broadcast by Ken Coleman of the Harvard-Yale 1968 football game. And of course, that was from my father. The other was from my mother. It was the Beatles' White Album, which had come out the very day before the Harvard-Yale game. So to write this book, I interviewed 54 of the players who played in that 1968 game, some of them for 10 and 20 and 30 hours. Every single one of them had a fascinating story about how they navigated that time. And I could have written about any one of them, but I knew for narrative purposes, if I wanted people to read the book, I really had to focus on 3 or 4 from each team. And I wanted to tell you about 3 of the players, just to give you an idea of what I was trying to do in this book, what I was trying to get at. First one was the Harvard tackle, Rick Byrne. Now, he arrived from upstate New York. He was All-American from upstate New York, and he arrived freshman year at Harvard as the absolute quintessential jock. Football was his entire life. Very first day of practice, in line for the very first drill, he got into a fist fight with one of his teammates over his place in line. Well, football was his world, at least until the 3rd game of his varsity football career. He was running down the field on the opening kickoff, and he didn't see the Penn player coming at him from the side. And the Penn player leapt into him, helmet first. In those days, spearing was allowed. You could lead with your helmet. Smashed into the side of his knee, shattered his ACL, his MCL, and his meniscus. And there was a question as to whether Rick would ever be able to play football again, much less be able to walk without a limp. In those days, ACL, MCL, torn meniscus was pretty much the kiss of death. Well, he did play football again. He played in that 1968 game. But an interesting thing happened during his 10 months of rehabilitation. And that is that his world widened. In fact, his world widened so much that he became an avid anti-war protester. He ended up being one of 2 Harvard football players to join SDS. If you were around in 1968, I'm sure you recognize that as Students for a Democratic Society, what at the time was thought of as a radical leftist group, even a Marxist group. Well, Rick joined SDS, one of 2 Harvard football players to do so. And the following April, 4 months after that game, he would be among the group, the SDS group that stormed University Hall, occupied University Hall for a night until the following morning. The Cambridge police and the state police dragged them out using liberal use of their batons, and Rick would get a nightstick in the groin for his pains. Then there was Yale running back Calvin Hill. Raise your hand if you remember the name Calvin Hill. Many of you probably remember him as a legendary running back for the Dallas Cowboys. Well, in high school, Calvin Hill was an All-American quarterback in New York. But in college, Even in the mid-60s, even at the height of the civil rights movement, quarterback remained essentially a segregated position. In 100 years of college football, there had been only a handful of African-American quarterbacks. In pro football, it wouldn't be until that year, that fall, 1968, that there would be a starting African-American quarterback. It was believed that African-Americans couldn't handle the demands of calling plays and reading defenses. African-Americans who played quarterback in high school were routinely moved to another position in college. So Calvin Hill went to Yale because he wanted to be the first African-American quarterback to play at Yale. And interestingly, he actually considered Harvard, but in 1964, Harvard had started the first African-American quarterback in the history of Harvard, in the history of the Ivy League. His name was Johnny McCluskey. So Calvin Hill goes to Yale intending to play quarterback. 2 days into freshman football practice, he was moved to fullback. Now, in fairness, that was largely because the coaches weren't fools. They wanted to get Hill and that aforementioned player whose nickname was God, real name was Brian Dowling. He wanted to get his two best players into the backfield at the same time. And Hill accepted the switch. Some of his fellow African-Americans at Yale tried to get him to quit the team, but his father said, no, you play where the coach puts you. But it would rankle him for a long, long time, that switch. And he would always wonder for years afterwards, what would have happened if he'd been allowed to play quarterback at Yale. Lastly, I want to mention Harvard safety Pat Conway. He would be an all-Ivy and all-East safety that year. But when that fall, he had not played a game of football, hadn't even touched a football in 3 years, because in 1965, he'd been asked to leave Harvard for plagiarism. And at that point, he enlisted in the Marines. And at the same time, most of his classmates were doing everything they could to avoid going to Vietnam. Pat Conway was doing everything he could to get to Vietnam. For very complicated reasons I go into the book, he wanted to be sent there. And he was. He spent 8 months leading a platoon in combat, and 3 of those he spent dodging mortar fire during the siege of Khe Sanh. In the fall of 1968, he returned to Harvard, and of course he returned to Harvard, a Harvard that had completely changed since he left. Now, when I began researching this book in 2012, I thought that I was putting together a snapshot of an era that had long gone by. I thought really that I was sort of preserving a gridiron fossil in amber. In 2012, the divisions of 1968 were really hard for me to imagine. But as the years went by, of course, those same issues, many of which not were solved in the 60s and 70s, but progress had been made, let's say, those issues resurfaced, and many movements were revived to combat those issues and to deal with them. Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, 50 years, of course, after Carlos and Smith, athletes were using the national anthem to protest racial injustice again. 50 years after Nixon, election of another deeply polarizing president. By then we had not one, but two seemingly endless wars. And so as I started interviewing all the players, they started using the words, you probably remember them, déjà vu. Can you believe it, they'd say. It's 1968 all over again. And after the book came out in 2018, at almost every reading, we'd end up talking about the similarities and the echoes between 1968 and 2018. And of course, who thought it could get any more polarized? America in 2021 makes America in 2018 look, relatively speaking, like a vast communal kumbaya. And of course, I found this tremendously depressing, and I find it tremendously depressing. And of course, it reminds me of that old quote by George Santayana, the Harvard philosopher. And incidentally, he attended the 1882 Harvard-Yale game and was inspired to write an essay deconstructing the Harvard-Yale rivalry. As many of you know, he famously observed, "Those who cannot remember the past are doomed to repeat it." And here we were repeating and repeating and repeating. Now, I want to mention a young Yale alumnus, a former student of my wife's. My wife teaches at Yale. And he's in his late 20s, and he read the game when it came out. And he had a very different reaction. It didn't depress him, but he'd had no idea that the country had nearly split apart in 1968. But his reaction was different. He said that reading about 1968, the tumultuous 60s, it didn't depress him. Rather, it gave him hope. He knew that we'd been down that road before and that our country had somehow survived. So I can only hope that we'll survive what we're going through now. So looking out at your faces, I want to end this on an upbeat note, not on a downer. And also in the interests of bringing my little talk full circle, I'm sure you remember we were taught in Noble's English classes, often a good technique in our themes was to come back at the end to something we'd mentioned at the beginning. Well, I'm going to do that now. Very good trick. I'd like to conclude with an inspirational quote that I think is applicable in almost any situation. You'll find it helpful, whether you're fighting for social justice, whether you're trying to get out the vote or trying to book a COVID vaccine appointment or trying to write a fifth book, or maybe just trying to play a little Thanksgiving touch football with your grandchildren without throwing out your back. In the immortal words of former Noble and Greeno midget football coach Bob Bubbles Bulkley, play hard, play to win, and never give up. Thank you.
Okay.
So.
All right. Thank you so much, George. And I know everyone is eager to chat. So I'm actually going to stop the recording now and give us all a chance to have an informal Q&A. So thanks everyone who is watching, and I'll stop the recording now.